Howdy folks, this will be an interesting tutorial and I expected it might take a long time for me to explain every nitpicky part of this, but I did want us to go over auto layout and specifically not about how to use it and what you can do with it in Figma, but I did want to explain some parts of auto layout in terms of how it is being translated into other means, such as what does auto layout mean in HTML and CSS, and ultimately what does that mean in Webflow. So as a forewarning, I'm going to be switching a lot of screens. For instance, you're going to be seeing this is my Figma screen, and then at certain points you will see this screen, which will display our HTML page that we've just built. And then on the right, I will pull out the actual HTML and CSS file in a Visual Code Studio editor. And then you might see the Webflow page that we are building out to kind of mimic what we are doing in Figma. And for some reason, you might see me pulling OBS because I am a little self-conscious. I'm recording what I'm recording. So yeah, let's get started with Figma, and I just drew a rectangle with red stroke. Nothing crazy here, but the first auto layout frame that you will see is this element 1. And I will copy the same for element 2. So easiest way is you make a text, and then I will shift A, and then you'll see it when you hover over it, it's frame 2. So let me just actually name these element 2, just so we know. By default, Figma will always just add 10s to all these values. I don't know why, but I am going to already put 0 for those values, and just for the sake of differentiating these two, I will give element 2 a stroke border color, and we will make that green. And then we will just make it the same size as element 1. And then on the right here, you'll see this little grid of 9 points. And that just basically gives you an option of where to align the objects within the frame. So we are targeting the typography. And so I want it to be to the left and centered. Now you can't see it centered because the box is not big enough to see that it is centered, but if I were to make this box big enough, you can see it centered. And then, if I did play around with all these different points, you can see that whatever's inside of the auto layout, it will move. So let's leave it to the middle, and then so if you wanted to get back to the original size, you just click on this height here and go to hug contents, and that will just basically make sure the height is equal to whatever it is inside. So as an example, if I were to increase the font size of this, you'll see that the auto layout box is increased to be as big as that font size. The coolest thing is, as I pull the code up, again, I'm not here to teach HTML, I'm just kind of showing what it is doing. But you can pretend that this div class is basically your auto layout, right? And element 1 is our text. Again, the div class for element 2 and our text. And then what I did, let me close that out. And what I did here was I styled element 1 to have a border 1 pixel blue, because that's what we have in Figma. And then I'm going to give element 2 a border 1 pixel solid green. And if I refresh that, you can see that it is green. Cool, right? So it's one-to-one relation that our div is basically an auto layout. So let's do the same thing on Webflow. On Webflow, I have element 2. So if I open this little navigator up, you can see the makeup of my Webflow. Don't worry about body. Container is just that red border that we have. Section is just, just don't worry about that for now. But you can see that we have our div that's wrapping around our text, and another div wrapping around our text. So on the first one, we already have a blue border. On the second one, let's add a border, which is found on the bottom here. And if I gave it a style of a solid line, and if I just type in green, it should look green. So we kind of have a perfect representation, not only on Webflow, but also a simple HTML of our, let's move that up there, of our Figma mockup, right? Now, here's where things get pretty interesting, where I will put these two, well, actually, let me do one thing first here. So if I clicked on element 1, here's my frame. I want to mess with these padding values. So if I put 10 here and 10 there, you can see element 1 has changed. And element 2, I had to move it because element 1 was interfering with it. And let's do that on our coding side. So element 1, what did I do? I basically gave it a padding 10 pixel for horizontal and 10 pixel. First of all, this is vertical and then horizontal. So if I save that and refresh, you'll see that it looks different. Element 1 matches to what we have in Figma. And what you also notice is that it just smartly just pushed element 2 down. And that's because HTML is a little bit smarter than Figma. And that's why Figma added a few tools to mimic how HTML and Webflow works. And let's do it over here. So here I want to add a padding of 10, 10, 10, 10, and then you'll see that element 1 got that padding, it pushed element 2 down. Pretty awesome. All right, so we are going to do the same to element 2 in our Figma mock. And then we'll have that. And I will just repeat the process here, but we don't really necessarily need to show that. Oops. Pretty sure there's a way you can easily make all of them 10s without having to do each separately, but it is escaping my head right now. Okay, so again, everything is very similar. Maybe move this up. So what we want to do to change things up is turning on our Figma file these two into an auto layout group. So I'm going to select element 1, select element 2, shift A, and now you can see it merged both of these to a frame 1. And let's just, I don't know, let's just call this section by chance. And then lo and behold, we have a similar structure as our HTML. And then if I went to Webflow, you can see that we have a similar section structure as our Webflow. So that's pretty cool. Now, what's also cool here is now on Figma, we have some special tools, again, we can work with. Namely, is you have this gap tool. And if I press 24, you'll see that the in-between space between these two elements is 24. And I could increase it or decrease it depending on what your desired result want to be. So let's make it 24 for now. And so how do we mimic that for HTML? Well, what auto layout does is essentially it takes two groups and put it into another group and gives it a special property. And there's different ways to do it in HTML, but the easiest one to showcase is something we call flex. So what I'm going to do is create a style for this and then display flex. So this is the same thing as if I was going to select element 1 and 2 and then did a shift A in Figma. I'm basically saying, hey, use this type of layout group. Now, in HTML, you're going to see something very interesting. Once I refresh, you can see that now HTML just automatically assumes that you want this to be side to side. And let's do the same thing in Webflow. So in Webflow, we have our section, and they have a really convenient way of showing your layout properties here. And you want it to be display flex. And boom. So this is really cool to see that the HTML file is, well, the Webflow is mimicking very closely to how HTML is doing things. So if you're really good at HTML and CSS, you will really like Figma because they're almost one-to-one in how you expect it to act. On the contrary, Figma isn't like that. Figma just is more, I would say it's more catered towards mobile design. And so it is automatically assuming everything you do wants to be cascaded into a column, which makes sense because you're just designing in Figma versus actually coding and seeing how things work. Now, to mimic side to side, we would actually have to use these tools And you'll see one that says vertical layout, so it's vertical right now. But if you did horizontal layout, now you can see it being side to side. Now the coolest thing about Figma is it makes a lot of shortcuts because it's just assuming that you want all these things to be flush to the right or be full width. And that's a great assumption because that just makes designing pretty easy. But on coding side, we had to do something a little bit different so that it is, we just had to describe it more. So if I did flex one here and then flex one on element 2, hopefully this will be what I expected. Yep. And so we're just basically saying like whatever space that is available, use it all. And then if you do it for 2 elements, they are both taking as much space as they can without interfering each other. And so that's why it looks like they are taking up basically half and half. So you have 2 columns. And then on Webflow, we are trying to find our section. So if you have a problem finding your correct div, you could always pull out your navigator and then select it. And I believe here, actually no, you want to click on the individual one, and then you basically want to grow as possible. And then click on the other one, grow if possible. And so that's basically doing the same thing I've said, is like, hey, I want to keep your size as big as possible, but without affecting any of the other elements. And if you have 2 elements doing that same kind of thing, then you basically just cut your thing in half. All right. So we have everything very mimicky here of each other, except on here we had that gap, right? So how do we fix that on HTML side, or how does that translate on HTML? Well, easy. They actually have a CSS property called gap. And so if I save that, and if I went to my Figma, then you can see that 24 pixel gap. How to do that in Webflow? What does that mean in Webflow? Well, very simple. Let's find our section that has our flex, and look at that. They have something called gap. So I put 24, and now it looks like that. Pretty cool how that all works. And so that basically is how auto layout works for the most part. I will show a few things here just to kind of give more fluff to the video. So let's say you did want it to be vertical. How do you exactly do that on HTML, or what does that mean in HTML? Well, it just simply means this, where we define the direction of the layout, which is the flex, and we want it to be column. And oops, I refreshed the Webflow, but if I refresh the HTML, you can see that now they are in a column, and it's still respecting that gap of 24 pixel. If I click to my Webflow, so they have buttons similar to Figma. If I click vertical, boom, it is the same. Very cool. Now, trying to think of something we can do here. Okay. let's say on here, let's say one thing we wanted to do is horizontal, but I want it to be that the width of element 1 is not flex 1. So flex 1 is similar as it's going to be similar to saying fill container. But let's say I just wanted to hug contents, and this one I also wanted to hug contents. But I want element 1 on the left and element 2 on the right. So instead of defining a gap here, you would basically define it as auto. And what auto does, it basically calculates how much spacing is needed in the middle so that element 1 would be on the left, all the way to the left, and element 2 would be all the way to the right. So auto just automatically does that math. You don't have to figure it out. And that's the coolest thing about enabling some type of text into these boxes rather than just numbers. For the coding side, it's very simple. So let's get rid of our column here. So it'll default to row. So if you want to specifically say something is in a row, you would say flex direction row to be horizontal. But by default, just remember this is what it is. And normally you would change it to column because you want something specifically columned. So we have this, and step. Now again, we don't want it to expand all the way to fill the container. So we remove the flex 1, and now we get here. But we did want it to be 1 on the left and 1 on the right. So what do we do here is we define it, justify content, space between. And this is going to be the same thing as saying auto in that one field. We're basically saying justify content is a special way of aligning items, a flexed item within the layout. Space between is kind of just the way to say what I've been saying is like whatever space you need to put in between two objects so that they are pushed to the left and right, insert that number in here. So it just automatically does that math. So if I save this, refreshed, now you can see element 1 on the left, element 2 on the right. And so you can imagine a layout like this where your element 1, and I can even change it here. So imagine this was your logo. And then imagine element 2 was your navigation. So you have something like that. All right. And then let me just do that on the Webflow side, which will be very simple. Let's click on our section and we want it horizontal, right? So we'll do that to choose it to horizontal. And then for our first block here, again, we just want it to shrink. Second block, we want it to shrink. So let's look what we have now is kind of like similar to what we had previously, but now we want it to be separate. And I believe there's a way to do this. Just need to remind myself here. Is it just auto in here as well? No. Oh, okay, right here, yeah. So on the x-axis, you could choose space between, and that will automatically do the math to figure out what gap is needed in here to be this. And the coolest thing about that is if you were to change your container, so if this was 600, it'll just keep on doing that math. So that's why auto space between, whatever you do in Webflow is very important to understand that concept so that you can achieve what you want. So again, this can be your logo, and this is your navigation. And already we've just created the foundation of what I have here, basically, other than there's a third element in there. So you would just put an element 3 in there as, your button, or element 4 would be this little snippet. And then you can just play around with it, utilizing auto layouts, obviously in Figma. But if you were coding it, then you would just have your flex. And if you were in Webflow, you have flex as well. Now, you'll notice that there is something called grid, which is going to be very, very, very similar, but I'll do a tutorial on that differently. Maybe just to explain, like, why would you use one over the other? Personally, the easiest answer to that is if you just have 2 items, use a flex. If you have more than 2 items, especially if you have like cards or, ideally a grid of stuff, then use grid. But can you use grid for 2 items? Yes, you can. Can you use flex for more than 2 items? Yes, you can. It just depends on how you're thinking and what you want to do. There's generally, you do want to use grid for more complex layouts. But if you have a very simple layout that's, mainly 2 columns or 3 columns, you could probably use flex just to keep it simple. All right, cool. That's basically what I wanted to show on auto layout. And, hopefully you guys understand now